somebody who has written extensively, not only about the economics of misinformation, which is probably something that is very well associated with him, but also about the high degree of polarization in American politics, and in the present context, very relevant to the fact that how Kamala Harris joining the race will have a deep impact, at least on the current presidential poll scenario. Professor Matthew Baum, welcome to NDTV. And my first question to you, sir, would be, how do you think Kamala Harris joining the race now and President Biden, of course, exiting the race, how does that change the scenario, the electoral scenario for the presidential elections in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think it completely upended the way things were heading in the weeks before Biden dropped out. Almost all of the oxygen in the campaign was about Biden's age and whether he was up to the task and whether he had any chance of winning. And then the Republicans were very sort of had kind of a triumphal convention, and they were talking about sweeping the Congress, and the Democrats were feeling really gloomy. You started having some big donors withholding campaign contributions, and it was generally looking pretty bleak. When Biden dropped out and immediately endorsed Harris, and everybody sort of in the party sort of quickly coalesced around her, it just flipped the script, because I think a lot of Democrats were, as I said, feeling really borderline hopeless about the trajectory of the campaign. And this was kind of like a shot in the arm, created a lot of enthusiasm, really impressive and quick donations, apparently on the order of 200 million in the first week in terms of campaign contributions to Harris. The polls started showing her more or less even with Trump, whereas Biden had been running consistently behind in most of the swing states. So in the short run, at least, it rejuvenated the Democratic campaign. I mean, it's hard to say how it will play out in the longer run, because, you know, she hasn't run a campaign like this before. And the Republicans hadn't really been directing their fire at her. And now they were obviously thrown off balance in a big way by this. And then after that, you know, you had the really shaky introduction of J.D. Vance as Trump's vice presidential candidate, and the gaffes that he's committed. And so as a consequence, so far, she hasn't really sort of endured an aggressive campaign, focus by the Republicans and by the media. But that is sure to come. So we'll have to see how it plays out over time.
Professor, you have also written extensively, researched extensively about misinformation, the term that is loosely known today as misinformation. You've also written about the economy of misinformation, as in the money that misinformation makes for certain products, certain companies. Do you think that it is because of the phenomena like social media and the proliferation of misinformation that Mr. Donald Trump remains immensely popular, despite what many would say incorrectly held beliefs and incorrectly articulated commentary, in the sense that it is at least not factual?
Well, I mean, I think social media was obviously a critical tool in his rise in 2015 and 2016. He was treated as kind of a joke by the mainstream media when he first announced his campaign in 2015. And it was his ability to communicate directly with tens of millions of people through his Twitter feed that kind of allowed him to run sort of a guerrilla campaign and allowed him to kind of do an end around the mainstream media. But that said, I think it's an overstatement to say that he's immensely popular. This is a very divided country. His approval ratings tend to run between 40 and 45%, which is not what I would call immensely popular. Because we have an electoral college and that has sort of a variety of majoritarian elements baked into it, you don't necessarily have to have majority support to win an election. Seems pretty unlikely to me that Trump will ever have consistently the support of a majority of Americans. But critically, he doesn't need that. So he has played to the conservative and right-wing base of his party. Almost all of his appeals focus pretty narrowly and targeted on kind of motivating his base so that they vote in really high numbers and hopefully demoralizing the other side, the base of the other side, so that they don't vote in similarly high numbers. So it's very much about getting your people to the polls and trying to suppress the other side, rather than building a broad coalition that would make you kind of a majority or would win you support of the majority of the electorate. So yes, he's disproportionately popular among white men, especially working class white men. Those aren't the only folks that support him, but it is kind of a core constituency for him, for sure.
It is interesting, Professor, even probably disheartening to many, that you have repeatedly described America as a deeply divided country. Do you think that social media has a role to play here, or do you think that it is just one of the factors? It is the factor that I was interviewing Thomas Friedman some time back, and Friedman said that, social media is like a dart gun. And how much, you would attribute how much attribution you would do to the social media for the phenomena for the rise of Trump and for the phenomena that we are seeing across Europe as well?
It's certainly not because of social media. Social media is certainly not the cause. Polarization in this country sort of bottomed out after World War II in the 1950s and into at least much of the 1960s, starting in the early 1970s with Watergate into the 1980s. We've seen a steady, gradual increase in polarization. It increased with the emergence of Newt Gingrich in the House of Representatives and a different strategy for trying to regain the majority in the House by tearing down the other side or demonizing the other side, more aggressively than had been done before. Then during the Clinton administration with first the Whitewater and then the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Then you can think about the controversies around the 2000 election in Florida and the Iraq War and the financial crisis, and just go forward, and you can see the polarization was increasing over. There was this arc of rising polarization emerging over 4 or 5 decades. Social media doesn't exist before 2008 or so. And it really doesn't become kind of the force that it is for some time until sometime after that. So what does that mean, that social media don't matter? No, they certainly do as an accelerant, among other things. Thomas Friedman, journalist, not professor, I'm sorry. His analogy, I think, is a pretty good one. That gives everybody a dart gun and allows them to sort of fire at each other. And it also facilitates, to some extent, the kind of the emergence of echo chambers that take people who are angry and introduce them to other people who are angry so that they get to make each other more angry. And that has resulted in an increase and the extent to which the two sides dislike each other. It's not just they disagree on policies, but they just don't like each other. And there are all sorts of examples of how that's manifested. So I think social media are an accelerant that exacerbate the problem, but it's absolutely not the case that they created it.
And how much do you think, that science of fake news that you talk about and the economics that drive it, that is behind polarization? And then let me broaden the arc of this question and, let me say that not just in America, American politics, but the world over, the polity in general, the administrators appear to be deeply divided now. I mean, something that was probably never the cause or the case 2 or 3 decades back.
Well, I suppose I would tell kind of the same story with respect to misinformation or fake news that, it can be harmful. Most people don't encounter very much of it most of the time. The latest research suggests that, even during presidential campaigns, people aren't encountering or sharing a whole lot of misinformation, except a relatively small portion of the public is, disproportionately strong partisans who already know what they think, for whom this is, again, more of an accelerant than a creator of their attitudes. That's not to say that it can't be harmful, and in certain situations, very harmful. So I think misinformation is definitely bad. And if you want to sort of talk about this globally, you have governments attempting to orchestrate disinformation campaigns to sort of stir up polarization. We certainly saw that with Russian efforts in the 2016 and to a similar extent, although it didn't get as much attention in 2020 in the U.S. And there have been plenty of incidents around the world where false stories have led to things like riots or innocent people being attacked or killed, possibly influencing some election outcomes in some places. But all that said, I don't think I think we can attribute too much to misinformation or fake news, as you said. It's very easy to point at that when there are a lot of other things going on as well. I don't think misinformation explains the rising appeal of right-wing populism that has sort of spread in Europe and to some extent in Latin America and elsewhere. I think you can identify a variety of factors that have developed over time that explain this emergence much better. That doesn't mean that populists don't exploit misinformation and social media to help their causes. They do, and it helps them. They're tools that facilitate some of the goals of populist politicians and their supporters. But that's different than saying, then again, attributing all the badness in the world to these phenomena.
Economy in the United States has performed very, very strongly, actually, many observers would say, post-COVID, under President Biden very, very well. And despite that, the working class base of at least the white majority is completely allied to Mr. Donald Trump. Trump remains extremely popular. And there are serious charges, at least in the press. Various publications have said that are there against Mr. Trump. And despite that, Donald Trump remains extremely popular. And Mr. Biden, despite doing well, doesn't seem to be popular on that front, at least. So what do you think is behind that?
Well, I think there are several things going on here. For one thing, and I was just talking about this with my students yesterday, actually, what happened with, in terms of the economy, most of the economic indicators in the U.S. Have performed really well, in some cases better than, as well as they have in half a century. What the real outlier is that we had this spike in inflation. It didn't last that long, but Americans haven't really dealt with inflation in like 4 decades. And it sort of became this mythological boogeyman that especially Republicans have been sort of sounding the alarm on again and again and again, decade after decade, even as there was no inflation. So when it finally spiked up, it kind of drowned out everything else. Inflation is scary because when you go to the grocery store or a gas station and prices are substantially higher, you notice that instantly and it makes you feel poorer. But it is also, it weighs more heavily than a lot of these other more distant things like the unemployment rate or economic growth or number of jobs created, because it's more personal and combined with the fact that it has been elevated to this mythological boogeyman, because we hear stories about runaway inflation in the 1970s, even though most Americans, or at least most Americans under 40, weren't even born then, and sort of have no experience with the consequences of that. Now, so the inflation declined pretty rapidly and is now only a little bit over sort of the Fed's ideal long-term target of 2%. I think most recently it was running at about 2.5%. Far from a crisis, but as we have seen for decades, public recognition of a change in the economy, especially an improvement in the economy, lags that change substantially. And that's even before you get to the polarized environment in which one side will absolutely refuse to acknowledge that anything has improved. We are more polarized, and half the country is much more stubbornly resistant to accepting that anything good could possibly be happening. So, all of these things combine to reduce the extent to which Biden can benefit from having a good economy. In terms of, Trump's support, this is the subject of much debate. How much of this is about, economic hardship, this sort of the Rust Belt, white working class in the Rust Belt and on the family farms being left behind, and how much of this is sort of cultural resentment, the sort of racial and ethnic diversity, the rising racial and ethnic diversity in the country, the increasing prominence and emphasis on progressive ideals about LGBTQ rights and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of those things that the Republicans have emphasized that resonate with people who may resent the sense that their country isn't the way they remember it to be. I think there are economic dimensions. Sure, there certainly have been substantial problems with addiction and the opioid crisis. Energy transition has been really hard in some places like West Virginia. So there really are economic factors, but there's also an important cultural dimension. And that's not just in the United States, that's also in Europe with all of the immigration, for instance, following the Syrian civil war, which created economic pressure in those countries and cultural resentments, which populist parties were ready and waiting to exploit. So, there are a lot of things going on, but it isn't just an economic story. And even to the extent it is an economic story, it's not a complete mystery, I think. I think it's kind of, if you kind of look at the way things have unfolded with Biden, as frustrated as the White House surely is, you can sort of see why there's this lag. I mean, if they had another year rather than just a few more months, I think eventually, the fear of inflation would recede, assuming inflation remained low, and then people would start to notice some of the other things, assuming unemployment stayed low and interest rates start to come down, and and the economic indicators remain positive. But that lag I mean, it's the same sort of thing that doomed George W. Bush in 1992 in his campaign against Bill Clinton. The economy had recovered well before that election, but most Americans thought we were still in a recession, and that hurt him a lot in the election.
And my final question to you, Professor, is that how much do you think realistically Kamala Harris has a chance against the very rampaging Donald Trump at this stage? Remember, the whole instance at Butler has also accentuated his popularity amongst his base, at least. And can Kamala Harris actually really hope to win this one?
I think it's a toss-up right now, honestly. I think it's too close to call. Certainly she can win, and certainly he could win. If you had asked me this a week before Biden dropped out, I would have said Trump is in the driver's seat. Right now he's on defense and she's on offense. The Democrats also have their convention coming up, which will give them sort of an addition, usually would give the party that's having a convention a boost. So that momentum seems likely to last for a while. It's unclear whether it'll be enough to win the election. We'll see, but I definitely think she is competitive at this point, and more so than Biden was.
And thank you, Professor Baum. Thank you very much. And thank you, as always, for your absolutely cogent, crystal clear views on issues that are extremely tricky and probably have a large portion of the world in their grip.